Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I'd like to welcome you back to the lecture series for History 101. This lecture is going to go ahead and finish up the lecture that we started when we were talking about the medieval Christian church. This is the slide we kind of left off on. And we talked about the investiture controversy, and we talked about how the investiture controversy actually led to a growth of papal authority. Now, point number B is where we kind of left off because we hadn't discussed the Crusades. But now that we've done so, just to recap the effect of the Crusades, again, the Crusades had primary two effects. One was the exhibition of papal power, and the second effect of the Crusades eventually would ultimately be the weakening of Constantinople and the later crash or fall of Constantinople to the Muslims in 1453. Now, if we take a look at the height of medieval power, what we see is we would focus upon the Pope known as Innocent III. We talked about Innocent a little bit in the Crusade lecture. He was, of course, instrumental in launching both the Fourth Crusade as well as the Albigensian Crusade, and also in planning but not living long enough to actually see the Fifth Crusade. And in terms of medieval politics and medieval power, we signify or we designate Innocent III as being probably the most powerful medieval pope in medieval history. A little bit of his background: he was a canon lawyer. He focused on canon law during his papacy, and he also worked to kind of build up the doctrines of canon law that particularly related to papal authority and papal power. You'll see there on the outline, doctrine of excommunication. What that refers to, of course, is under Innocent III, the idea of excommunication was fully defined, and in fact, Innocent III made a lot of use of that doctrine in that he excommunicated at least 3 powerful kings. One term on there that you might not be familiar with is the term interdiction. And what interdiction refers to is actually almost the excommunication of a place. Interdiction is the belief or the practice in which the papacy can actually suspend all salvatory grace in the form of sacramental grace, which, as we kind of mentioned under the Crusades, was a big impact or a big piece of the power and the spiritual authority of the Christian church. So Innocent III went toe-to-toe with basically every king of Europe during his papacy, and surprisingly enough, he actually came out on top in all 3 of his contests. He fought with both King John and with King Philip II of France, and he also actually had a fight and almost excommunicated and did excommunicate Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, not to get into too much detail in terms of these disputes, suffice it to say that Innocent III really defined papal authority with what he called, there were 2 separate theories that he talked about in his letters. One is called the Two Swords theory. And Innocent III basically described the power of the papacy as a spiritual sword that could be wielded by the Pope to actually damage or even kill the soul. The Two Lights theory, in case you're wondering, was Innocent III's metaphor for the power of the papacy in relating it to the sun, and the power of secular kings that he related to the moon. And he argued that, of course, the sun was the greater of the 2 lights, the more important of the 2 lights, and as a result, it was a metaphor for how strong and how necessary the power of the papacy was. Obviously, the Earth can get by without the moon for a few days during a new moon phase, but it can never get by without the sun, and that was Innocent's argument. That was his point, that Europe might get by without the secular power of kings, but it was really the papacy that gave light to Europe and actually helped it grow and helped it change. And as you might expect, this is a radically different perspective than what we saw in terms of the papal court and the popes in the early 600s and 700s. If you remember, when we talked about the Carolingians, the popes had to seek out and gain the support of the Carolingians, in particular Pippin the Short and Charlemagne, in order to kind of cement their power and kind of enforce their authority. But what we see under Innocent III is almost a complete reversal. We see, in fact, a very strong papacy that is dictating to other kings what it's going to do and how they're going to react and what they're going to do in order to support that papacy. So, in terms of the medieval church, what we have seen over the course of these, probably 600 years, is we see a dramatic reversal of secular power and spiritual power. Now, that will not last, however. Innocent III was probably the most powerful of the medieval popes, and also, too, he's one of the last powerful popes. After Innocent III's reign, we begin to see a general decline in the power of the papacy that is really going to take effect in the later 1200s and into the early 1300s. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And so, in terms of our decline of the medieval church, we start to see a failure of leadership or ineffective leadership on the part of the popes in the late 1200s and early 1300s. Now, the reason for that is pretty simple. The deterioration of leadership, as I say in point number 3, can be linked, I think, in a small part, to the effects of the bubonic plague. As we talked about, or we will talk about when we talk about the bubonic plague, is that, in terms of the outbreak of the plague in 1347 to 1352, the bubonic plague really dramatically damaged the church in the form of eliminating a lot of the priests that were actually catering to the needs of the poor and the sick. What we might call perhaps good priests. And as a result of that, the deterioration of leadership can in fact be traced to a lack of people that have the leadership skills. In the absence of having a good candidate, the Roman Catholic Church has to promote someone in order to take the place of bishop, to take the place of cardinal, and ultimately to take the place of the pope. And because of that, even though the leadership qualities were not there, those individuals, those men who were able to secure the papacy, did in fact, wield a lot of authority, which a lot of times was wasted or squandered. And because of that, we begin to see in the 1300s, throughout the 1300s and into the 1400s, we see a rise of both ineffective popes and weak politically powered popes, as well as we see some really kind of low levels of base morality in some of the popes. Some of the popes are going to engage in heavy corruption and bribery. And some popes are even going to go as far as to assassinate their enemies and kind of definitely not provide a spiritual model that the popes were supposed to provide. Now, in terms of our class, when we talk about the medieval church and the medieval papacy, I think an important event to talk about is the papal reign of Boniface VIII. You see, Boniface VIII had taken over from a pope who had basically abdicated the papal court. He had abdicated the papal throne not once, but twice. And as a result, we see a very kind of low point in terms of papal leadership right before Boniface VIII is elected pope. And shortly thereafter being elected, Boniface VIII tried to reestablish that papal authority, and he tried to kind of impress upon the kings of Europe, and in particular the King of France, Philip IV, he tried to impress upon him the power of the papacy. But unlike Innocent III, Boniface VIII's authority and power had greatly diminished. And so in a dispute over taxation, Boniface VIII actually wound up losing to Philip IV. He was captured and taken hostage when Philip IV kind of sent emissaries down to collect Boniface VIII. And unfortunately, while he was trying to escape, Boniface VIII was badly beaten and wound up dying. And pretty much after this, what we begin to see then is we see a continuing decline of papal leadership, as well as after 1305, we see an increasing domination of the papacy by the French, and in particular the French government. And so, if we, just to kind of finish up and sum up, if we take a look at the power of the papacy, It started out pretty small and pretty weak, and definitely in reference to the time period of the Roman Empire. You know, the first popes were fairly underground because of Roman persecution, or kind of not very visible in terms of their power base. Constantine himself, of course, wielded a lot of power and did not really share that power or tolerate any kind of power from the papacy. And shortly thereafter, with kind of the decay and collapse of the Roman Empire, that's really when the Roman medieval church and the papacy kind of stepped into that void and began to reassert or to assert its power on a very large scale. That power was still fairly weak all the way up through the 600s and 700s and 800s, but it's really during those reform movements of the 900s, 1000s, and 1100s that we see the papal monarchy, as it is sometimes called. We see that papal authoritative structure continue to build and to reach the heights that it would under Innocent III. But as is the case a lot of times, we have a very slow kind of build up to a peak, and then we have a very sharp decline. And that is definitely the situation when we discuss the Roman papacy. It built its power over the course of 3 or 4 centuries. It had about 2 centuries of height, and then pretty much in the later 1200s and early 1300s, that power base had kind of diminished, and we then see about a 300-year, 400-year process by which the power of the papacy is kind of eradicated. And even to this day, the current popes, the modern popes, have never wielded as much political power as what Innocent III did back in the 1200s. I hope that's been not as confusing. I do apologize, or at least I think this is probably the best way to do it. I didn't want to really finish the medieval church lecture without kind of taking a break and talking about the Crusades. But now that we've done that, these 2 lectures, Medieval Church 1 and Medieval Church 2, can kind of be played back to back after you've seen the Crusades lecture. And I hope that doesn't cause any confusion. I thank you for listening to the lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you again. Thank you.